We've been really pleased this week to have this space to be able to have this sort of art and archaeology exhibition. And Rob and I have really enjoyed putting together all the work and doing all the research for it, which has all been about how we can imagine underneath the ground and find new ways of communicating that. So we'll talk a little bit more ourselves sort of afterwards. So just to briefly introduce everybody, I'm Rose, for anyone who doesn't know, and I've been doing the archaeological work here. And this is Rob.
Hello.
And then we've got Lesley and Joss, who've really kindly come to talk with us tonight. So I think we're going to begin with Lesley, who is an amazing archaeologist and a very inspiring, creative person. So we'll just get into it really and think about landscape and place and all things lovely. So over to you, Lesley.
So I was going to throw my notes on the floor, but also talk a little bit as an archaeologist about the relationship between archaeology and art, or relationships that I see. And I suppose before I start, I should say that I don't do Roman archaeology, and I think it's quite important to say that here. I'm a prehistorian, and I study things from about 12,000 to 4,000 years ago in Britain, France and Portugal. So I don't have any textual or image work. The people and the humanities that I study, I completely understand them and place and landscape through the relationship in a material world. And I think that's really important when you think about this project. The two main things that I think as a prehistorian or archaeologist that connect to this project, one is context, and the other is time. And what I mean about context in archaeology is in the process of excavating the material relations in terms of things within the material world, the spatial relationships, but also the relations between things, pots and bones, how things connect together physically. That's what we mean about context. And that's about things being in place. And one of the big things about this project has been the in situ nature of it, about it being in place. So I'll talk a little bit about that. And then the other is time. And I don't mean time in terms of, there's that stuff from the past and then there's us in the present. I mean that past is present. And it's not faded and gone and ephemeral. Actually, it's very vivid and alive within our present if we just take the time to think about it. So that in situ nature of Soundmarks, and also by being in place, doing the sound and the painting, how it's about duration and taking time over things, is very important to the project, I think. And archaeology and this art project, they both ask, how do we know a place? There's the importance of sight in Rob's graphic scores. We've got a series of sites around the room with Rose's artworks, but there's also sight for each sound piece, Soundmark, that we've got. And if you think about how those were created by Rob, by being in place for a long time to be able to capture sounds that he then threads through the music inspired by being situated in place too. So as I've been listening at site to site, you've got the bird song and the rain, you can hear digging tools, the river and bell chimes. These are the sounds that come from being in place through its inhabitation, by actually existing and being there long enough to listen. So this is an art practice in time. And archaeology is a practice that takes time too, if you like. In fact, archaeologists spend so long and take so long and think about time in the world that there's an anthropologist called Tim Ingold that says that it's a really strange form of inhabitation, how they're there with the detail, slowly working through something in order to understand it. And I think there's that parallel with both projects. But also this art project, not just in the way it's produced, but in how we use it. We can hear different sites with different sounds. We can see the different paintings, but there's also that trail that we can use, and we did that today. And if you haven't done it, please do, because going to each site and seeing the images and listening to the music makes you stop, it makes you think, and it makes you look at detail in another way that's really quite special. And that's actually very archaeological. One of my favourites, I think, as I was walking around today, was listening to Forum, because it was so, as I stopped, it seemed, okay, there's a forum here, it's very Roman, how am I going to get myself interested in this? But as I was listening to the music, there was the sound of digging, there was the TikTok music, there were birds and there were bells, and it was incredibly thick and detailed. And it made me notice other things that I hadn't seen before, fading out, and then me taking the earphones off and thinking about other things within that space. It's really beautiful and very special. So there's something about slowness, and it's only through stopping that you can see detail that I think archaeologists do to understand the material world of others. And I think this project does to think about place and landscape. And there's a medieval historian that also talks about the beauty of taking time over things and slowing down and noticing detail. He's called Geoffrey Cohen, and he writes, "When we decelerate, imagine a deeper past, get geologic, then history becomes more eventful, richer, deeper in its strata. Modernity loses some of its lustre, prehistory loses homogeneity, and the agency of the material world becomes easier perceived alongside that of the human." And you notice that detail much more, and it makes a difference. So stopping and listening at each site to in situ soundmarks produces slower, detailed registers to how we look at the world. And that's what the archaeologist does too, really. Well, we use trails and things too, rather than sound in art. But that process, if you like, is there. And it's also how you know place, rather than just anywhere. And it's also how you think about how landscapes are meaningful and constructed and connect together. Because as I was stopping, that's when I noticed the terraces, the hollows, the ridges, but also you start to see other features move up from the subsurface because I've got geologic, I've stopped to notice that detail. So if you're from Aldborough to go around doing this, you'll notice other details, or the other details will come to the fore and enhance something else about places you already know. So I've talked lots, about the sound and not really about Rose's paintings. And I think it's very important about this project, the fact that Rose is an archaeologist. Well, she's from this area, but she's an archaeologist and an artist. That relationship is key to this project, really. And it doesn't happen very often, and it's very beautiful. When you look at her paintings, many of them they're in plan and section, but she's playing with them. Archaeologists draw in plan and in section to reveal relationships about landscape and place and the material world. But she tweaks, she puts, for example, over in, what's this one called, Rose, again?
The pinky one on the next one.
That one there, yeah.
The forums on the left.
It's the forum.
Yeah.
In the forum, you've got things in plan, and then you've got the ditch and section. They're twisted together, and that plays really, really beautifully. That this is not archaeology, it's something else. So I find that interesting. But the other thing that really strikes me about Rose's artwork is that unlike archaeological plan drawings where we'll draw in pencil or we'll draw in pen, everything's in the same colour, everything's in a thin line, and what it does is that richness and texture and depth that I've been banging on about, we almost conflate it and reduce it and get rid of it when we start to record and draw it, and it becomes really problematic. That's not going on in Rose's paintings. They're vivid with different kinds of colour, different kind of textures, and that plays with time. So things that are very, very early features are actually the most prominent and vivid and are still acting in the world and changing ditches and fence lines hundreds, thousands of years later. That there's not an ephemeral past to a new, richer, vivid present. You know, that it's got a force to it, the past coming through. You can see it in the village section there, those circular forces coming through. And particularly for me here, the circular enclosure pushing at the later walls and boundaries, which are much, much later in time. But there's that physical presence of the past changing and making the present, if you like. Archaeologists are not very good at doing that in drawing. They're thinking it in their process, but they're not doing it in their drawing and creative practice. And that's what's so exciting about this. So making that enclosure so strikingly present, that the ditch in the forum is incredibly beautiful and important, because it's telling you about time that are not simple. They're not simply processes of accumulation. There were them, and now there's us, and then there'll be someone else. That's not what happens. People push through, or they get forgotten, and then they get re-remembered. Time's a muddled up thing. There are things from many times within our world, and there are many other presences within our world, but it's just about thinking about it. So time's not always linear in the material world, and in Mosaic's field in particular, that earlier circle is pushing at later lines of wall. And in the quarry image that we have, you can see on the stones that there are lines of the quarry process and of working stone, but also there's the sediment that catches between those stone that tells you about abandonment. But then you've got new lichen growth and as a sort of Japanese bindweed growing and taking over these places. So there's the marks from the past that still look fresh because they're tool marks in stone. There's sediment caught between stones that tells of abandonment, and then there's the reuse of space by new plants transforming it. Time's not just this sequential thing, it's complex and textured. There's an experience of place there about fresh things and worn things, made and unmade and remade again things. Don't want to bang on too much, but there's one other thing that's important about this project, and it's actually very archaeological too. It's about how very, very small things can actually say very, very big things. And particularly in this Paleochannel piece, in the music and in the artwork, and in the thing, a Paleochannel, an old channel. In archaeology, Paleochannels old river channels are incredible things. In Aldborough, the river silts of your Paleochannel are the ones that go back into prehistory. There's Roman rivers, there's the prehistory of the Neolithic there too. It's the deepest time within this work is caught within the Paleochannel. So it's there in the river silts and the formation of the river. But it also has the tiniest thing caught within those river silts, which is pollen. And pollen is a seasonal thing, So you go from thousands of years of soiled silts of the river through prehistory and deep time to pollen, which is, you can't see it. Well, it can make us sneeze a lot, can't it? But we can't see it. It's the tiniest of things, and it's seasonal. But what that does for the archaeologist, because we go from thousands of years to seasonality, is we can construct landscapes from it. That small, big kind of a thing is really interesting. And it's in these painted thin sections. You can see the lamination. It's almost as if you have to go up close, like it's under a microscope to see the pollen. And then it also in the music, I feel it's there because I don't know if it's because there's the prehistory there for me, that this is the piece of music that is strangest of all. There's that strange bird cry within it. And there's a sound which is tight and deep and makes the familiar really, really strange. So as if there is something deeper at that site. A real depth of detail, if you like. So that relationship between small and big is important in this project and in archaeology. And there's one other thing that I think I want to say that probably is more important to me as an archaeologist than maybe you. But it's about how this kind of project is not just something that makes archaeology better. And archaeology is not just better from having this kind of artwork. Because I guess what I'm trying to say here is it's not about representation. It's not representing what the archaeologist does. And that relationship's very important. What it's doing is the two of them together. How you think archaeologically and how you think through creative art practice. Together they create something else, using the skills of in situ and time, small and big, detail in different ways. They transform and create something else. So this isn't just a better representation of landscape or place or the past or a different representation. It is archaeological, and archaeology can change too through thinking in these much more creative ways, and together they do something else. So it's not about reconstruction or representation. It allows you to know a place and landscape in more detail, and it allows you or makes you think about time in terms of past, presents and futures. And it makes us all the better for being able to do that. Through both of these things being together, archaeology and art, it creates something else. And I really urge you to go and do the sound trail and the in situ work, because it's just beautiful. And I'll stop.
Thank you very much, Lesley. It's already making me think about my own work differently. So we'll move on to Joss now. So Joss Smith is from the University of East Anglia and teaches contemporary literature, but is a creative force in his own right as a poet and writer. So we're very pleased to have you here too, Joss. And it's, I don't know, I'm still thinking about Leslie's scenario. So to plunge you straight into to your one.
Well, firstly, thank you as well for having us here. It's been an absolute pleasure to be to see this place in this way and to enjoy the artwork with you as well, not just as visitors. What in the world is someone who teaches contemporary literature doing here, talking about archaeology? I don't know a great deal about archaeology at all. The literature that I write about, that I work on, is nature writing predominantly. One of the interesting tensions to nature writing for me is the relationship between the scientifically knowledgeable and the personal and the imaginative. there are relentless debates and discussions and arguments among nature writers over whether it should be more scientific or whether it should be more poetic and imaginative. And for me, that misses the point, that the real strength of nature writing is when it's both of those things together. And I mention this because I think this exhibition does that exceptionally well. It brings together knowledge and poetry in a powerful way that allows you to forget that there are two different things, and that compounds them into one thing, which I think has something to do with what you were saying there about it creating an other thing.
Another thing.
And I want to talk a little bit about that other thing here. So I'm very struck by the way this work has drawn on the scientific data and on scientific methodologies as well. It's interested and it's concerned with those archaeological surveys and their kind of magnetic traces, those very interesting maps that Rose has shown me at length around this around this village. It's concerned as well with evidence and with artifacts, and it's concerned with the same sorts of things as I suppose archaeologists are. But what it does with those things is slightly different. It's interested in the way, I guess, imagination and those facts, those bits of knowledge collaborate together. And it reminds me, and this is something that Rose and I have talked about a lot, that both archaeology and geology are imaginative sciences, that there are the kind of hard science aspects of that. There are the knowns that are represented in the data, but there's also the process of linking up those knowns, of communicating those knowns, and that's an imaginative process. That's partly about storytelling, but it's not just about creating the story, it's also about sharing the story. And I was really struck by something that you wrote on the blog, that you said that, where is it now? Archaeology is concerned not just what's there in the ground, but with myriad ways of sharing it. And I think that sharing becomes a part of the art aspect. It's what takes the facts and weaves them into culture that makes them about now, about who we are today as well. So that sharing and that communicating helps to establish and make that knowledge alive today. And now, as I was thinking about this, it reminded me of something from my own field, and it would be remiss of me not, at some point, to get a bit of literature in here. What it took me to was William Blake and his understanding of vision, and what he means by the term vision. And that seemed to speak to what's going on in this exhibition. So vision for Blake is different from sight. We see something, and that's our eyes kind of receiving something that's there in the world before us. But for Blake, sight becomes vision when that thing that's seen becomes creatively worked in the imagination and is shared with others. And that, for me, is a really interesting definition of vision then, because vision stops being just about receiving the world. It becomes about receiving and creating. So for Blake, you create to see. And that there's a wonderful paradox, but a wonderful truth in that vision is about creating to see. And I began thinking about this because that sat uneasily with me compared to what you were doing here, because it's a very visual metaphor, and I think a lot of what you're doing is about getting away from the visual, even though this is visual art. And I was thinking, well, what would be a kind of sound, a sonic equivalent of Blake's vision? And I kept coming back to this word sound, but sound as a verb rather than sound as a noun has a very interesting ambiguity to it, the first meaning of sounding as a verb is to take a boat out and to drop lead weights on strings to the bottom to measure the depth of an estuary channel or an ocean. To sound was to travel to the bottom, was to think your way down into what lies beneath, to begin to measure and investigate depth. Well, there's that fascinating kind of ambiguity, because to sound is also to sing out, to produce, to create something audible, to be full of sound. And for me, there's a really nice relationship between Blake's definition of vision and what this exhibition, I think, does with sounding. And so I thought that might be a useful term with which to think about what's going on here. I think that your work sounds this landscape in that it investigates it, but that it kind of sings it out as well. It creates something other for the landscape. And I think it's really important to have a sonic or auditory metaphor or non-visual metaphor, because I think this is landscape art that does something extraordinary with the tradition of landscape art, which is still dominated by the visual, pictorial, looking into a perspectival landscape from a distance. When we think back to the kind of the early forms of landscape art and the picturesque, it's very often predicated on distance. The picturesque tourists would take their clawed glass, a sort of a piece of glass that was set on black velvet, and they would find the landscape they liked, and then they'd turn their back on it and look at it in the mirror, and then paint an image of the mirrored landscape. So, I mean, I'm being a bit harsh about landscape art here, but it's very interesting how this steps away from that distant peering into a landscape. And what we're thinking about here, or the way I find myself reorientated in the landscape with this art, is Rob, with your work, to be immersed within something, to be at the centre of that landscape. And hearing it today, I was walking around and suddenly I was so aware of the things that were around me, the sound of the church bells singing out that wedding, the sound of traffic and dogs barking. I felt at the centre of things in a way, and the smells as well. Suddenly the smells I was very aware of. But Rose, also with your paintings, I think they do something very interesting, because they reorient us away from that perspectival looking into a landscape as well. We're never quite sure whether we're looking down onto what lies beneath, or for me there's something that's so essentially textured in your paintings, and as I was walking round today, I was suddenly so aware of the ground right at my feet, the interlacing of straw on the mud, the fact that landscape is something that is immediate and felt and very proximate to our fingertips. And I think your work does that exceptionally well. So the moment we get away from this sense of a landscape painting as representing, as something that we can peer into, suddenly the materials themselves of the artwork become really important. And the more you think about the particular materials, both in terms of the sound and the visual artwork here, I feel that we're not just drawn to these art objects, we're drawn to them as processes. And I know you say on the website as well that the process was almost more important to you than the product itself. And I was really, really struck by that there are some amazing processes going on here that I think really, really bear thinking about at quite deep levels, for the way they speak to our ideas around memory and around authenticity or fidelity to place. And just a couple of things I wanted to pick out. Rob, you write about this idea of graphic scores, and I don't know if you've had a chance to read that whole website, but this idea of a graphic score is fascinating. So you take some of the archaeological survey maps and then lay musical staves over them and look at the data as if it were notes on the staves and play that. That's a really kind of fascinating way of working, because it allows for eruptions of, I don't want to say chance, but because it's more than chance, it's something more interesting than chance. But it's less simple than authenticity as well. And I was really struck by that. But also your idea of granular synthesis, which is a digital process where you pick out a detail and open it up into big sounds. And you notice the similarity between granular synthesis and actual archaeology, where you pick out a detail. And wax, Rose, in your paintings, your use of wax, I think, is really fascinating. And if you haven't already, take the time to look for those moments where she's using wax. So she's laying down something that would initially be invisible on a white page, and then painting in ways that allow the wax to haunt the paint. And I think that's a really interesting process to think about in relation to what's going on with archaeology and the contemporary as well. The ways in which sometimes the invisible can make itself visible in strange and unexpected ways. So and then the final thing I just wanted to mention was the form of those soundings, or sound marks is a much better word. I think is really interesting as well, as something that engages us and invites us into the landscape in a very different way. So it begins with Rose's writing a kind of story of place that is fantastically grounding in sort of a surprising and welcoming way. And then we move into these kind of the graphic scores and the more sonic and sound-based work, which takes us into a level of abstraction, so that it's inviting us into a depth, but it's not telling us anymore what it is. It's just immersing us in a kind of architecture of mystery, which I found really compelling, and it invites meditation, reflection, and all sorts of different responses. It creates a sort of sonic space for us to dwell in and think about what this past might mean to us. So the form of those pieces, I think, is really interesting. It often ends on a detail that's recorded from the landscape itself, and then you take the earphones out and suddenly you can hear either bells or traffic or something, and you're back again, having never gone anywhere, but being there again. It's a wonderful thing. And I just wanted to end on an image that this all reminded me of, and that's, I remember going to, I think it's probably in Canada, a castle where we got toured around the castle, and there was a deep well in the middle of the castle, and the guide, to show us how deep the well was, he would light a match and drop it down the well, and you kind of peered in to this glow disappearing into the darkness below you, and it was so compelling and inviting, and it just inspired your imagination. And that, for me, reminds me of what you're doing here, about drawing us down into a mystery, but illuminating it in some way as well. So that's to say thank you.